Hello, and welcome to today's webinar entitled The Comic Book Industry and Homefront During World War II. I see some of you guys already know the drill and you are putting down where you are streaming in from, but for those of you that are new, we invite you to tell us where you're streaming in from. It's just fun for us to see where everybody's coming in from, but also, because today is about comics, I would like to invite you to put down in the chat box who your favorite superhero is. I will kick off that trend by saying my favorite superhero is Captain America. He's just my favorite. While we wait for people to sign on, I'd like to give some shout outs. I've got people from Arkansas and Arizona coming in. I've got Arlington, Texas, Bulverde as well, the Colony, San Diego. Ooh, we have a Wolverine fan. One of my sister's favorite superheroes is Wolverine. Let's see, we've got Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor in that specific order. Okay. Let's see, we also have some Delaware people coming in. And where else? Richmond, Texas, New York, Houston as well. We have a Wonder Woman and and Robin, the boy wonder. I like the tagline. And Green Lantern and another Wonder Woman, Batman. There, I was wondering when Batman was going to show up, and some more Wonder Woman. Like to see her there too. She's a favorite of mine as well. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest presenter for today. Her name is Heather Anne Tolliver, and she is a nonfiction writer who is coming to us today from Arkansas. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much for having me, and welcome to everyone who's here with us today. Let me start out by saying I'm a professional writer. I got my degree at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and while I was there, I studied a lot of rhetoric. And what I was most interested in was the discourse surrounding third wave immigration to the Lower East Side of New York City. And these immigrants fought for unions, fair wages, reasonable working hours, safe working conditions, child labor laws, women's rights, personal freedoms, et cetera, et cetera. And that brought me to studying comic books. And I'll explain all that in a few minutes. But what I do want to say is that while I didn't specifically study war comics in college, the beginning of the superhero comic and the war are undeniably connected. So we can get started. But let me caveat that huge statement with this. Today's webinar is intended to be a wide and shallow look at how World War II impacted the development of the comic book industry with a sharp focus on the superhero genre. There are lots of deeper dives that could be an option at another time, but today we're just wide and shallow. So I want to start a little bit about the comic books industry, how it began. It began in the late 19th and 20th century, evolving from different earlier forms of visual storytelling, like sequential art, and particularly newspaper comic strips. What you see on the left of this slide is a Peanuts comic strip. Now, I'm not quite sure if this is from the 1930s, but Peanuts is my favorite sequential art comic strip, so I picked it. And so the origin of comic books was that they started taking these comic strips and putting them all together in a book. And then they would sell those books for like 10 cents a piece. And at this time, the US was coming out of the Great Depression. And so we had a little bit more disposable income and we wanted entertainment, but we wanted cheap entertainment. And that's the void that these comic books filled. And so eventually they ran out of newspaper comic strips and they go, oh, well, okay, we need some original stories. And it just so happened that two writers from Ohio had created what we now know as Action Comics #1, the image on the right, and the first appearance of Superman. And with this comic started the golden age of comic books and the superhero era. And that era before we move on, let me just say that era saw the creation of characters like Batman, that was 1939, Detective Comics number 27, Wonder Woman and All-Star Comics number 8, October 1941, Captain America number 1 in March of 1941, and so on and so forth. Okay, so while superheroes is what, superhero genre is what we're here to talk about, I want to remind everyone that the comic book is a medium, and the superhero is a genre. There were lots of other genres involved in comic books at this time. There were romance comic books, science fiction, horror, westerns, lots of different things. But superheroes were the one that really made the big bang onto the scene at this time. And I feel like that is tied directly to the fact that the US was preparing to enter World War II. And so when we look at the genre conventions for superheroes, Peter Coogan, in his dissertation that he wrote probably about 20 years ago, proposed that there are 3 things that make a superhero: a secret identity, a costume, and a pro-social mission. Now, I know some people are going to be like, well, Iron Man doesn't have a secret identity, or everybody knows Steve Rogers as Captain America, and that's true. Secret identity, most of them do have one. And when you look at the archetype of a superhero, which is Superman, he does have a secret identity. Almost all of them have costumes, right? Because that's how you know that they're different, that they're special. That's how you recognize them. But most importantly, I think all superheroes have that pro-social mission, because without it, they're a villain. The pro-social mission is a selfless action taken on behalf of society. And that is required for a superhero. So let's move on to the who and the why. The comic book industry was not created by a single person, but emerged through the efforts of multiple publishers, writers, creators, artists. And it just so happened that it started in the Lower East Side of New York City. Now, what was going on in the 1930s on the Lower East Side of New York City? That was a hub of immigrants on the Lower East Side. That area was filled with Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. All of the names on the right side of the panel are first generation Jewish Americans in this country. And they all played pivotal roles in developing the comic book industry. Now, the question is, why did Jews create this industry? I mean, from the publishers down. Well, there was a lot of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic sentiment at the time. And these creators, artists, writers could not get jobs at newspapers or with regular publishing houses. So they had to create their own industry, which they did. And so these influential creators, I'm just going to run through them. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster created Superman. Jack Kirby and Joe Simon created Captain America. Will Eisner created The Spirit. He's so famous, regarded in comic book circles that the annual award for the best comic is named after him. Bob Kane and Bill Finger, they created Batman. And I added Stan Lee to this list. We're not really going to talk about Stan Lee here because the comic books and characters that he's most famous for were not created until after the war, where it ended the golden age of comics and began the silver age of comics, or what we call the Marvel age of comics. That's when Stan Lee started to take over the industry. But I do want to spend 1 second talking about the military service of some of these writers and creators. Joe Shuster was actually classified as 4F, so he was unfit for military service due to poor eyesight. But he contributed to the war effort through his work on Superman comics, which were used in war bond campaigns and morale-boosting materials. Jerry Siegel was drafted into the Army in 1943. He served a non-combat role. He produced military publication and materials. He also drew a Superman comic strip for military newspapers. Jack Kirby he enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1943. He served in Europe as an infantryman and a scout. So they would send him out and he would draw the surroundings so that when for troop movements, they would have an accurate map of the areas that they were going into. Will Eisner actually pioneered the use of sequential art in training manuals for the military that they still use to this day. And because that was essential at that time, right? You're drafting a massive number of men that have varying degrees of education. And so you need to be able to train them quickly on different things, but mostly how to repair their equipment. And so Will Eisner used sequential art to be able to teach them how to do that. Bob Kane and Bill Finger, neither one of them served in the military. Bill Finger was classified 4F, but they continued their work on Batman, promoting war bonds and the Homefront efforts and things like that. And then Stan Lee did enlist in the Army in 1942. He worked in the film branch, creating training films, but also creating propaganda films. And I would say all of that to say, Tikkun Olam, that's the pro-social mission for superheroes. It's a Jewish idea that we are here to repair the world. So that is the pro-social mission for superheroes going forward. We're going to repair the world. These writers and creators saw that need even before the war, wrote comics about it, and then later fulfilled that obligation as members of the military where they could. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Homefront. During World War II, comics served as a major cultural force in the United States, shaping public opinion and morale. And when I say everybody read comic books in the late 1930s, early 1940s, I do mean everyone. Like estimates are somewhere around 85% of Americans read comic books. That's adults and children, because they were accessible and affordable. They reached millions. They were shipped overseas more than any other periodical. And so soldiers were also reading them. The comics emphasized themes like patriotism, sacrifice, vigilance, portraying the war effort as a collective struggle that required contributions from everyone. Like I said, I'm going to say this multiple times today. They encouraged war bond purchases, scrap drives, adherence to rationing, on and on. They also were draped in patriotism. Comics would depict civilians contributing to the war effort through community actions, victory gardens, working in the war industries, again, buying war bonds. They also preached about vigilance against saboteurs, enemies inside the U.S. One of those, if you see something, say something kind of ideas. They also talked about empowering everyone, regardless of gender or age. Like everyone played a role in defeating the Axis powers. And still then so, they also had a lot of anti-Axis powers propaganda. So on a few of these slides coming up, you're going to see some pretty nasty caricature drawings, especially of Japanese soldiers, but all of these portrayals of the villains, the Nazis, the Japanese, were intended to vilify the enemy and to have Americans see them as other. So first, we're going to talk about Superman. Superman, again, the quintessential American hero. Again, his first comic came out like 3 years before the U.S. entered the war. Superman on the whole did not really fight on the front lines ever. His comics were really focused on home. And I think it was a point of issue with his writers. It's like, if we send this all powerful, superhero over there, he could just defeat Hitler like instantly. And that's kind of demoralizing, right? Like, our military is trying so hard to gain ground, and Superman could do it in an instant. So we're just not going to put him in that situation. So one of the more infamous things about Superman is they had him sign up to enlist. He goes to get the eye exam. He goes to read the eye test, and his eyes actually go through the wall, and he's reading the eye test on the next room instead of the one in his room. So he fails it. So he is a 4F. They don't let him into the military. But in his stories on the home front, he was a champion of workers. He fought against corrupt businessmen and war profiteers who exploited laborers and undermined production. He reinforced the importance of fair labor practices to support the wartime industries. Again, community vigilance. He exposed spies and saboteurs in American towns, encouraging civilians to stay alert. His comics also included public service announcements promoting adherence to wartime regulations like rationing or conserving resources. And as an alien immigrant with extraordinary abilities, he embodied the American idea that anyone, regardless of origin, could contribute to the fight for freedom and justice. Let me talk a little bit about Action Comics #1. In this issue, Superman was presented as a crusader for justice. He used his power to fight societal ills. In this issue, he saved a woman from domestic abuse. He exposed political corruption and war profiteering by a sitting U.S. congressman. And I believe he saved someone that had been falsely accused who was sitting on death row. And again, this was published 3 years before the U.S. entered the war, but Superman was established as a protector of the common person, a theme that would resonate through his comics, even to this day. Again, it was relatable struggles, ordinary people, helping ordinary people rather than tackling cosmic or otherworldly threats. Like, there were no supervillains at this point. It was just criminals, him helping people protect themselves from criminals. And again, this was the archetype for the superhero. And by the time the war began, Superman was a household name. I would posit that Superman might be the most popular fictional character in the world. He is so well known. But let's talk about Captain America now. Captain America was introduced in Captain America Comics #1 in March 1941, and he became a symbol of American justice and patriotism, courage and collective action, and it resonated deeply with readers both on the battlefield and on the home front. I think we all know the story. Steve Rogers was a scrawny man who transformed into this super soldier. He symbolized that anyone could strive for greatness for their country. Again, early issues of this comic was him fighting saboteurs within the United States. Again, more war bond promotion. When you watch Captain America, the First Avenger, the Marvel movie that came out in 2012 or something like that, when they show Steve going around the country peddling war bonds, that actually happened. They had people dress up like Captain America going around peddling war bonds just to small towns all over the place to try to raise money for the war effort. And again, his character inspired civilians to be selfless, courageous, united, all of the things that the U.S. needed to support the war effort. And I want to point out his little sidekick here. We have Bucky. Anybody that's watched a Marvel movie might be surprised that Bucky is a 12-year-old boy. In the comics, he was. And because comics were very much like, oh, that was successful for you, let's see if we can do it for us. They saw Batman and Robin, and they go, oh, you know what Captain America needs? A teenage sidekick. So that's what they did. And in this middle column here with the cover of Captain America #1, you have possibly the most famous cover image in comics, maybe other than Action Comics #1, is the debut cover of Captain America punching Adolf Hitler square in the jaw. It captured the imagination of readers. And I think it's important to note that this was like 9 months before the US entered the war. At this point, America was still fighting over, whether or not we should remain an isolationist country. And here is this piece of art, this comic book hero that is saying, no, we should jump in here. They portrayed Adolf Hitler as the ultimate villain. And like I said, this was a controversial stance because isolationist sentiment was really high in the US. This was a rallying cry for American patriotism, showing that the fight against Nazism was both moral and necessary. And this, is a form of propaganda. And kind of it tried to shift American thought that this war effort was a righteous cause. It was necessary. And again, him confronting Hitler in the first issue cemented his place as a cultural icon, conveyed the idea that standing up to evil was a responsibility for all Americans, whether on the battlefield or the home front. And let's move on to Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman was a little unique in her representation, particularly for women's roles during the war. Her stories often highlighted societal issues tied to the war effort, blending action with themes of empowerment, morality, and justice. This is one of the only comics in the Golden Age that was not created by a first-generation Jewish American. She was created by a psychologist named William Moulton Marston, but she was created to inspire women to embrace their strength and independence. Her alter ego, Diana Prince, worked as a nurse and later as an intelligence officer in the European theater. But it also, her doing that highlighted the essential contributions of women in wartime industries and services. Wonder Woman emphasized that women were equally capable of bravery and sacrifice, aligning with the real life influx of women who had to move into those industries as men moved to the battlefront. When she did encounter the enemy, her stories frequently involved battling Nazi and Axis agents, promoting the idea that women were crucial in defeating tyranny. And she became a role model for women to embody truth, justice, and compassion. And that was seen as vital to the efforts on the home front. So I want to point out this cover on the right, the issue #7 of Sensation Comics. There's a milk truck on the front of it. This issue is called The Milk Racket. And this was one of her wartime adventures. It exemplified her commitment to protecting ordinary citizens and addressing societal challenges on the home front. It directly tackled corruption of essential resources during the war. So in this issue, she uncovers a crime syndicate tampering with milk supplies. And that's a critical staple, obviously, for children and families during war rationing. And the syndicate was watering down the milk to increase profits, endangering public health and violating wartime ethics. So on the one hand, it highlighted the vulnerabilities of civilian life during the war because, war profiteers are going to war profiteer, right? And so there was this vigilance needed to protect yourself against exploitation of rationed goods. It also reinforced the importance of protecting children, from the dangers of, this new world that the U.S. had moved into, and just kind of symbolized the future, that that we're protecting the future for our children. So in this comic, it kind of solidified Wonder Woman in her role as a protector of the vulnerable, especially women and children, and emphasized the importance of honesty and fairness in supporting the war effort. But again, so many of these comic books are about exposing war profiteering. It's kind of wild. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Bonds, anyone? All of these comic books, and probably many more, repeatedly put ads for war bonds in their comics. In this cover of Batman here, and like I said, Batman and Robin really didn't go to the front lines. Their comic basically still stayed as like Gotham City vigilante, right? But on the cover, like, here's a new gun from the folks back home, soldier. And then Robin says, yep, the folks that are backing the 7th war loan. So it's been going on for a while. More money is needed. And so the war bond request keeps going out. So I want to talk a little bit. So that was the home front. Let's talk about the battlefront. Oh, I did want to say, let me back up to this slide for a second. I did want to say there was a Superman Day at the 1942 World's Fair. They had someone dressed up as Superman to draw the crowds. And that day they raised over $1 million in war bonds and stamps just in that single day. So that's how important, that's how significant these characters were in American society at that time. So the superhero comics, especially on the battlefront, they had some specific roles that they were used for. Again, they were showing heroic actions for the war effort, whether they were engaging with combat with Nazi soldiers or disrupting enemy plans or assisting in intelligence or sabotaging missions. All of these stories reflected parts of the real life happenings going on during wartime. They also carried these very strong patriotic messages, urging readers to support the war effort. Everything reinforced the idea that we should support the war effort. They were a very, very good example of propaganda that came out very often and just reinforced the idea of rationing, victory gardens, just buying war bonds, pushing the war effort. And they also, like I said a little bit earlier, they did a really good job of demonizing the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians to a point. But generally, I think most of the really bad caricatures that we'll see were either German soldiers or Japanese. The superheroes were definitely a symbol of good versus evil. And again, they exaggerated the villains. Right now on the screen, we're showing Superman versus the Axis powers, but I do want to mention like the exaggerated villains. Like the closest thing you'll get to like a super villain at this time would be like the Red Skull, which is Captain America's arch nemesis. And in a lot of times, Superman, like I said, he was rarely there, but when he would do a few targeted things and that would be it. Captain America was seen more as one of the enlisted. And then in some ways, these real world events would be adapted for comics. Sometimes the comics and artists would take inspiration from actual battles and incorporate them into the stories. For instance, some of the comics would feature superheroes engaging in fictional versions of key military campaigns like the Battle of the Midway or the D-Day invasion. And that helped people at home feel connected to things that were going on across the ocean. So I just put these two examples on the cover of Superman taking these particular looks at the front. Because again, like I said, he spent a lot of time at home. But he didn't, like I said, he never directly fought Adolf Hitler or Emperor Hirohito. There were exceptions where he would undermine their authority. Like there was in Look magazine in 1940, there was a 2-page comic strip that imagined Superman flying to Berlin, capturing Hitler, and then delivering him to a League of Nations court. That was an alt universe kind of thing, right? But Superman was often depicted as helping Allied soldiers and troops without overshadowing their bravery. Superman stories did not want to do that. They wanted the soldiers front and center, where Superman would be their support. And that was their way of like respecting the real life heroes that were fighting and dying for the ideas that are depicted on the pages for them. I'm going to mention a couple of key issues and stories for Superman. And like I said, that piece in Look magazine was like how Superman would end the war. And I said he captured Hitler, but in that little thought piece, right, he also captured Stalin, even though Stalin was technically our ally in the war. But in that alt universe comic, he captured both Hitler and Stalin. In an Action comic storyline called Superman and the Saboteurs, Superman prevents the Axis spies from stealing blueprints for advanced military technology, ensuring America's technological edge. And then another saboteur thing, The Secret of the Steel Mill Saboteurs, he exposes a network of Axis agents who are sabotaging American steel production, which was critical for the war effort. He saves lives and resources. Again, more emphasis on the home front. He did have his moments, but most of it was at home. Superman had which I think at this time, most of the heroes had this, a moral clarity. They did the right thing because it was the right thing. Even if it was the hard thing, they did the right thing. And that was very profound and very symbolic for the readers of that comic. Captain America fought the Nazis, and he fought the Nazis on the European front. He, in several of his comics, he would have direct confrontation with Axis leaders. And that differentiated him from a lot of other superheroes at the time. But that was what they considered to be like a symbol of American resistance to tyranny. We've already talked about him punching Hitler in the face, but he also did work on the home front. He and Bucky would uncover and stop Axis agents' attempts to undermine the U.S. war effort through sabotage, espionage, or propaganda. He would also fight alongside Allied soldiers in his comics, boosting their morale and showcasing their bravery, same way that Superman would kind of step back. Captain America also stepped back. His stories highlighted the importance of teamwork and the contribution of ordinary soldiers. And Captain America is where you start to see like the pseudo-scientific threats. But again, this is a super soldier that was created with a super serum. So you're going to have a little bit of the magical, mystical weapons, grotesque powers. And again, the Red Skull was his big nemesis at the time. So you have that. In The Riddle of the Red Skull in 1941, he first battles the Red Skull. That was the first appearance of that villain. The Red Skull had powers like mind control. He wanted to commit mass destruction, which was obviously a very strict counterpart to Captain America's ideals. And then The Case of the Black Witch in 1943, Captain America uncovers a Nazi plot to use superstition and fear to control local populations. So he fought not just physical threats, but also psychological threats. So Captain America might have been the biggest propaganda tool that the U.S. had during this era, but it just makes sense. It's in the name, Captain America. I'm going to talk about a few lesser known comic books or comic strips now. And if you'll notice, most of the ones I've already talked about, actually, let me back up. One thing I did not point out on the Captain America slide. This is one of the few images you will see of, it's the right cover. It's one of the few images you'll see of Captain America fighting not Hitler, but the Japanese. And if you'll notice, this is a very terrible caricature of a Japanese person. And this caricature has fangs. So they're absolutely villainizing an entire group of people on the cover of Captain America in this image. And I mean, this is not the only one. We're going to see another one, I think, here in just a minute. But yeah, so we wasn't all super happy during that time. So we've got this one is Terry and the Pirates. And let me stop here for a second. Those previous ones, generally, most of them fought on the European front. And now we're going to talk about some of the comic books that addressed the Pacific front more thoroughly. And I think we can kind of guess why most of the major heroes that we still hear a lot of fought mostly either on the home front or on the European front. And I think one, they were created in New York City, and people in New York City were mostly concerned about the Germans attacking them through submarines and U-boats and things like that. But you can also think about these were all first generation American Jews who likely had families that were under the threat of German occupation or might have already been sent to concentration camps at this point. So there's a reason why most of those heroes are focused on the European front. But like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about the Pacific now. Terry and the Pirates, they fight against the Axis powers in World War II comics. They were created in 1934, but as the war, and this was a comic strip more than a comic book, even though they did turn it into books, it started as a comic strip. The strip had evolved from a tale of treasure hunting, escapades in the East, to a dramatic and patriotic war series that addressed the realities of global conflict. It was set in Asia, which makes it perfect to talk about the Pacific War. It directly engaged with themes of resistance against Axis aggression. The strip storyline overlapped with the war in the Pacific, like I said, and this comic became explicitly anti-Japanese. The villains often represented Japan's military expansion and its brutality toward occupied nations, highlighting the stakes of the Allied forces in this region. For an example, Terry and his companions thwart Japanese efforts to exploit local resources and population, often working alongside resistance fighters. Terry and his allies frequently assisted guerrilla fighters and oppressed civilians, showcasing the importance of grassroots resistance. That freedom could only be achieved through unity and courage. In one issue, Terry aids Chinese guerrillas in sabotaging Japanese supply lines. This strip did a really good job of highlighting personal sacrifices with characters facing loss, injury, and difficult moral decisions. They brought down to a much more human face than some of the superhero comics did. These comics avoided fantastical elements, instead focusing on the brutal realities of life under Axis occupation. It made the strip resonate with adult readers and servicemen a little bit more than the superhero comics. I mean, story arcs would depict bombed villages, internment camps, and the impact of war on civilians, reminding everyone of the human cost of the conflict. In an issue called The Capture of Pat Ryan, Terry's mentor, Pat Ryan, is captured by Japanese forces and subjected to brutal treatment. This storyline highlighted the cruelty of the enemy while showcasing the resilience of the Allied spirit. And that's just one of the many issues where they talk about like the real human cost at that time. And, it's Terry and the Pirates is kind of lauded as a very grounded portrayal of the war with characters that were flawed and deeply human. And I think a lot of times Captain America and Superman and even Wonder Woman can be seen as like not really having flaws. These characters did have those, and it made them particularly popular with soldiers abroad. I'm going to show a couple more. We've got Captain Marvel Adventures. That's what it was called at the time. And then a few decades later, Marvel copyrighted the name Captain Marvel. So now we know this character as Shazam. He says Captain Marvel swats the Japs. And then you've got some more depictions, unkind depictions of Japanese soldiers here. Again, Shazam was seen fighting the Axis powers, and a lot of his stories were in the Pacific. He fought not just physical threats, but the very ideas that underpinned the Axis powers. Like, he goes up against a villain called Mr. Mind and his crew of henchmen, showing the comic's clear stance against the threat posed by fascism and dictatorship. Again, Shazam also supported the effort at home. A couple of key storylines for him. We have the Battle of the Bulge. It was a 1940s comic. Captain Marvel's direct involvement in the war effort included stories in which he foiled German plots. In this story, he confronts a group of Axis agents attempting to disrupt U.S. military involvement in Europe. It's filled with patriotic imagery and emphasized the importance of defeating the Axis powers. There's a storyline about a Nazi spy ring that he uncovers and exposes. And then The Golden Hour, which was a 1942 issue, it directly reflected wartime propaganda as he's seen helping to stop a Nazi plot to destroy vital U.S. factories. It's a direct appeal to the American public to stay vigilant and support the war effort. As you read more and more of these, you're like, we were really concerned about spies in the United States causing problems for us in the war effort. And then there was one more comic I wanted to highlight. This one is called Black Hawk. Black Hawk was also, more of his issues were set in the Pacific. And here is another very unkind caricature of an Asian person. But I say that this comic was known for having a multinational team of heroes. The squadron had members from various allied nations, was united by their shared mission to defeat the Axis powers, and the theme of international cooperation was vital. There was a Polish-born Black Hawk leader, French pilot, a Russian fighter, and others. They had advanced technology. Many of the stories involved the squadron battling not only regular military forces, but also high-tech Nazi and Japanese weapons. They fought Nazi scientists. They also had issues where they had problems with obtaining resources like fuel and munitions and the need for secrecy and espionage and all those kinds of things too. This series also had heroic but flawed characters, and there were some personal sacrifices too that you tended to not see in Superman or Captain America or Wonder Woman. So again, most of these comics would bring through like a moral clarity, like there is a good guy and a bad guy, and we know who they are, and be vigilant, but also plant your victory garden, and also please buy a war bond. So let me back up. The war and storytelling. So before the war, these heroes, basically they fought crime. When you think pre-war, think about Batman, like what you see Batman doing now. Batman fighting crime, protecting neighborhoods. The world was very small for them, and they did what they did locally. And during wartime, those stories expanded, and now they're fighting fascists wherever they find them. They're rescuing POWs. They're liberating concentration camps. They're defending democracy throughout the world. And all good things come to an end, right? When the war ends, the demand for superhero comics kind of falls off a cliff. People wanted to read about other things. They didn't want to read about fighting anymore. And so other genres that had been there but had been way overshadowed by the superheroes, they start to emerge. So you start to get romance comic books and westerns and horror and science fiction, and those all rise. And it doesn't help that you had a psychologist calling superhero comics out for causing juvenile delinquency, and there was this whole big thing. But when I say superhero comics fell off a cliff, they really did. The only two superheroes that I can think of that have not stopped publication, I mean, they've never paused it, they've never stopped, is Superman and Batman. Every other hero from that time, Captain America, Wonder Woman, they've all stopped publication at some point. The pause may not have been long, but it did happen. And so, it was a tough time for the superhero comics. But like I said, they made a big comeback in the 1960s as the shift in social issues occurs. So the post-war comics, like immediately, they were talking about PTSD and the issues that you would have with an entire generation coming back from war. And then as you get further along, there are new fears arising. We have a Cold War that's starting. We've started the nuclear age, right? And that is when Stan Lee and the folks at Marvel, including Jack Kirby and Stan Lee are just intertwined there at Marvel, create almost every Marvel character you can think of. As the years go on, as the 60s turn into the 70s, you start to get, characters like Luke Cage, that is, his story started out with medical experimentation, and then you get Black Panther, and, that is about an African country that has never been colonized. And at one point, the Black Panther, he fights the Klan in over a 3-issue arc in the 70s. So it's very different. When superhero comics come back, it's a very different world for them to be in. I guess that's my point. So there's an enduring legacy, right? Superheroes have come back. Sales of comic books have not come back, but adaptations of superheroes obviously have exploded. And I think you can point back to the late 70s when you see Christopher Reeve as Superman, as kind of setting the stage for what kind of movie magic can make out of heroes. And then, you have a little bit of a renaissance. You've got Superman and Batman in movies, and then they kind of fade. And then all of a sudden you have the X-Men show up in theaters, and then kind of all hands on deck. And now we have multiple superhero movies every year. We get superhero television series. And I just think it's fantastic. But you can look at these and you can see what I said, that there's a pro-social mission, but the values change, right? And you can see what America cares about by what the heroes are protecting. And I think what's fantastic about comic books is you can open up a comic book from any time, open it up and see what does society care about at this moment in time. And I think that's fantastic. I think that's part of what I love about comic books, is that I kind of consider them as like folklore, like each new writer and artist tells sort of the same story, but they add their own flair. I mean, because Superman is still from Krypton, he's still raised by, adoptive parents in Kansas. Um, but how that impacts him changes with each telling or expands with each telling. And that's kind of what I like about it. And I think that is a good place to wrap it up.
Okay, well, I want to say thank you on behalf of all of our at home audience for your presentation. I know I learned a few things about comic books from World War II. And now I'm going to invite everybody at home. If you have a question, you can type it in the chat box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. We are running a little long on this particular
Sorry.
webinar. It's fine. But I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with one question that I had, which is of the superheroes discussed today, which of them do you think saw the most growth out of World War II?
I think, that's a good question. I think Superman has really changed the most, I think, in his depictions. And I think a lot of that is sometimes the people who are adapting him don't stick to the original narrative, and that's fine, I guess. But like, I like my Superman a certain way, but he has changed and expanded, I think, the most, because again, when he started out, he didn't have supervillains, but now you've got like Lex Luthor, and that can be really great. And he fights cosmic things now where he didn't in the beginning. And I think his story, even though a lot of people dismiss it as being like, oh, he's just a Boy Scout, oh, there's nothing exciting about his comics, I think there's a lot to be said for a character that does the hard thing because it's the right thing. And, I can appreciate that.
Okay, we have two questions that have come in, and I don't know a whole lot about this first question. So, what about Sergeant Rock? Were there classic comics?
Sergeant Rock, I'm not super familiar with that. I will say that some of the most like famous war comics came out after the war ended, if that makes sense. So I think like Sergeant Rock, I'm not super familiar with, but I'm thinking like Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos. That comic book came out after the war, even though it's set during World War II. So that's something that I think I will investigate if I ever need to do something like this again. But I did a fairly deep dive, and Sergeant Rock was not one that popped up on my radar for that.
Okay, so we have some more questions coming in, so I'll try to get to them as quickly as possible. Who was the author of the dissertation that you mentioned who defined superheroes?
Peter Coogan. Peter Coogan is I use his work in a lot of my research, but he really, like I said, the field of comic book studies is very new, and he's like, so we need to decide like what is a superhero, what does it mean, and he defined that in his dissertation, and a lot of people use that as a reference. But Peter Coogan.
Okay, and then next, were comic books prior to and during World War II a uniquely American phenomenon? For example, did they exist in any form in Britain or Germany?
So sequential art is not a uniquely American art form. However, the comic book, as we know it today, is. There are very few things that I would consider purely American art forms. The superhero comic book is one. The Hollywood movie is two, and jazz is three. I'm sure there are a few more, but those are the ones I can really think of. So yes, there was sequential art being done in other parts of the world, but the development of the comic book is absolutely an American medium. medium where it's so hard because where the superhero meets the comic book, like that's why comic books exploded was because of superheroes, even though other genres were involved. So it's hard to separate the two.
Okay, I really like this next question. I'm curious to see what you say. So, what do you think about Marvel and DC matchups?
Okay, here's my thing. I love this question. Okay, so for me, DC is filled with gods and demigods. So some of their stories are like um, very, they're not very earthbound, right? They're not really earthbound, and a lot of their heroes don't like lean into their flaws. Now there are exceptions, obviously there are exceptions, but their big name heroes don't really lean into their flaws. Where and also DC is not set in our world. Now, during this era in the golden age, yes, they were. But once we spin out of this golden age, they live in cities like Metropolis and Gotham City and Central City, whereas Spider-Man lives in New York City. And I think that's a very it may seem simple and not important, but I think that makes Marvel feel a little more real because you can look at it, you can see landmarks that you recognize, and it feels more like they live in this world. Whereas Marvel's heroes, almost all of them have some flaws to them, whether it's Tony Stark's alcoholism, um, Captain America's hubris at points, Tony's hubris at some points. Um, you know, and that's why I think sometimes that Batman really belongs with Marvel because he doesn't have any superpowers. I can't remember which of the Zack Snyder movies in, but he's just like, I'm rich. And that is his superpower. Um, and Batman would be my DC character with flaws. But I don't know. Like I enjoy Marvel more, but DC has some great characters too. It's hard to pick. Like when you ask like who's your favorite superhero, I would have to say Captain America also. He's my favorite. But I love Superman when Superman is true to his roots. All Star Superman is a fantastic comic. If anybody has the opportunity to read it, I think they also turned it into a animated series on HBO or Max. It's really good. I love it.
Uh, okay, so we had another question down. I think we had another question in here. We have some lovely comments coming in. Everybody's very appreciative of your presentation. Okay, yes, there was a question about historic comics. And are there any comics related to the Great Depression?
I would say there are probably comic strips that would be related to the Great Depression. And there were probably some, because again, when the comic book industry started, they were pulling out of the Depression. They weren't completely out of it yet. And there were other comics at the time. They were just different genres. They were not superhero comics, but romance, sci-fi, horror, westerns, that kind of thing. So that would be an interesting thing to look into about how those kinds of things were depicted. And I'm sure, I mean, because sequential art goes like way back, like political cartoons and newspaper comic strips, all those kinds of things. I'm sure that has been a topic in those for years before the superhero burst onto the screen. I'm just not super familiar with those.
We have gone a little longer than we usually do, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Before you go, I did want to let everybody know that I don't know if you know this, but in our museum store, we actually have a Nimitz comic. So if anybody out there is interested and inspired in looking at comics about World War II in current media, we do have one available for purchase in our online museum store. And we have our last Untold Stories coming up in December on Thursday, December 12th at 6 p.m. We will have a presentation by Dr. James Wilbanks called Danger 79ers, A Texan Goes to War. So again, thank you everybody for coming to today's webinar. We really appreciate you being here with us and spending part of your day with us. And we'll see you next time.